David Wayne Landrum. I was born in Arkansas, Newport, Arkansas, but moved to Indiana when I was 5. So really, Indiana was the place I grew up, and then came to Grand Rapids in '85. I didn't really start writing poetry when I lived there, but I think the land, the area you're from, affects how you look at life. Indiana is very flat. It's very rural. Now, I lived in not a big city, but not a small town either. There's about 60,000 people, so, a small city. But you don't have to go very far in Indiana to run into cornfields. So, the cornfields, the flat lands, the rural kind of look of Indiana, I think that's very much down in my bones, and it does, to a certain extent, influence what I did. There was a book called Spiritual Geography by Kathleen Norris, and it makes that point, that where we grow up really influences the way we look at life. So I think that did. I think it was nothing spectacular studying it in school. I liked to write when I was a kid, and I liked to draw, so I liked to express myself like that. And then about the time I got to school, I was interested in poetry. Now, a couple of things that I do remember that are memories. My mother, she went to school when you still had to memorize poems. And I have this vivid memory of one day it was raining and thunder and lightning outside, and she was sweeping the floor, and I was a kid. I was probably about 5 or 6. I was hanging around with her, and she recited that old Longfellow poem to me, "The day is cold and dark and dreary. It rains and the wind is never weary." And she did it, very much with, and I vividly remember that. It's one of those memories like I can see it in my mind still. And that made I think, a impression on me. And she did that, she knew other poems and would sometimes recite them. And then in 4th grade, if you can believe that, and I'm like 8 or 9 years old, had this teacher, Mrs. Cook, I remember her name, and she used to read to us every day. Now, sometimes she read Stuart Little, Charlotte's Web, she read kids' books, but I remember sometimes she read literature, and I can, again, vivid memory of her reading Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening by Robert Frost and explaining it to us. So, I had some kind of influences like that. But then mostly I think it was when I got to school and really started reading poetry in my literature classes. I liked Robert Frost. I like Carl Sandburg. Now, he's a poet that was popular in the 50s, but he's kind of almost faded from the scene now, but I liked his stuff. I read quite a bit of his poetry. And then the typical Sarah Teasdale, Emily Dickinson, a lot of the poets that you will find in anthology books. But Frost and Sandburg I really liked a lot. I guess I always had a creative streak. I liked to draw when I was a kid. And I wrote stories. I remember I wrote a story in my 5th grade class, and my teacher thought it was so good she read it to the whole class. So I just always had that kind of bent toward creativity. And just for some reason, poetry was the thing that snagged me. Now, I also write fiction, and I publish some fiction, but mainly the poetry. That's what got me. That's what I liked. That's what intrigued me, I think, the most. Poetry is, it's compressed emotion, it's compressed action. Whereas in fiction, you've got time to develop things. I think I always liked about poetry that it, I don't know, how do you say, it's just intense, the words. And I don't mean that's all emotional and everything like that. Some poetry is funny and that sort of things. But it just compresses thought, it compresses expression, and I like that. It will just come out and it's right there immediately. Whereas if you read fiction, it develops, and I love fiction, and I write it as well. But I like the way poetry develops. I like the way poetry functions, I guess you could say. The Slam here in Grand Rapids. Now, I'd been on other poetry scenes there, and there were other things, poetry conferences and things like that I went to that very much influenced me. But the Slam was just fun. I started going to it just out of curiosity. and started to hear different kinds of poems. There were some poets who were older, and they did the kind of beatnik style poetry. I heard some hip hop poetry. I heard political poetry. Now, I'm more of a formalist poem. I still write. Some of my poems are free verse. A lot of them are. In fact, the three that I won the Dyer Ives with, those 3 times, are all free verse. But I also wrote rhyming metrical. And so I thought, well, maybe I'm a little old-fashioned. People are going to laugh at this stuff. But then again, hip-hop poets rhyme. So I said, okay. So I read some of my sonnets, and I read some of my rhyming poems. And people generally liked it. People were very tolerant. They would, they were there to hear poetry, and if your poetry wasn't a certain style, they didn't boo you or anything like that. And I think they kind of liked the change from what they usually heard. Now, eventually, I did write some sort of hip hop rap style poems, but still struck with the style that I was familiar with, and still did that there. The dates, I'm not sure of. I'm a little rusty on that, but we went several places. For a while, we were in a building right next to Yesterdog. And we had it there for quite a few years. Then there was a theater that we had it in that was right off Division Street. And I can't remember the name of the theater, but we had it there. Then that had a stage and, auditorium seating, so that was nice. Those were the 2 main places. I think we had a couple of other places, and sometimes once in a while, we'd have it in people's homes. But mainly those 2 sites, yeah. Form, is a different way of expressing poetry. And I think it's good because it sort of takes you into language. That's what any good poem does, and that's kind of a vague, nebulous thing. But poetry is about using language, and using language in a way that is very declarative and that is evocative, that reaches into you and does something to you, you resonate with it. And, it's connected very much to our psychology in the way we're made up. Now, I taught Shakespeare for lots and lots of years, and there's one thing where I think it's Hamlet's mother, she makes an oath to him, and he says, "Are you going to keep this?" And she says, "If words be made of breath and breath of life, I have no breath to utter this." So she says, yeah, but that always intrigued me. If words be made of breath and breath of life, our words are very much come from our life. They come from our breath, which if we don't have breath, we aren't alive. So poetry, the utterance, I think, it sort of speaks to that magical, mystical part of the human being. Now, I like something like Robert Frost's poem, After Apple Picking. And it starts off, "My long, 2-pointed ladders sticking through a tree toward heaven still. And there's a barrel that I didn't fill, and there may be 1 or 2 apples that I did not pick upon some bough, but I am done with apple picking now." Now, see, you can do that with form. He builds that up, and then, but I'm done with apple picking now. And there's something about the phraseology and the way it sounds. But then again, there's a poem called 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird. And it is pure modern verse, and I love that poem. And it does the same thing in a different way, and that's something I cannot figure out, where he just sketches about blackbirds, and he says things that are kind of, to use a word, not a very good word, dumb. He says, a man and a woman are one. A man and a woman and a blackbird are one. And then other more elaborate things. He says something like, I have heard, noble sentences and beautiful lucid rhythms, but I know the blackbird is involved in what I know. And there's something like that does the same thing, and in completely different language and completely different style. And, if you know what it is, you tell me, but it does something. It uses language in a way that affects you, speaks to you. I can't think of any other words for it. Yeah.
That's beautiful.
So that's what maybe a little bit of why poetry. If I'm invited to do a reading someplace, I'll do some rhyming poems and some formal poems, but I always start off with something like Gary 19, '61, some of my free verse poems, because I think they're a little more accessible. And then you kind of lead people into, and then you can maybe experiment, bring a rhyming poem. Because people like rhyming poems. They like the rhymes. So I think that's because of their accessibility and readability to people. That's, I think, why I entered them so much and, won with them. The diatribes, I won 3 firsts and a third in them. Then I also, a couple of times, helped judge them. I was a judge. Of course, you can't do both, right? Say, well, I think this poem's good, and it's one of mine. So I was also a judge for it. But yeah, I was involved in that. Did the readings when I won, and always went to the readings and enjoyed them. So yeah, that's a great thing that our city does, and I'm glad it's part of festival. I think I won the first time. I believe it was '99. And then it was until about 95 or 96. I didn't win every year, but it seems like they were scattered over those years. It made me adjust my poetry, okay? My first 4 or 5 attempts, nothing, didn't win anything. So I said, what can I write about? What appeals to people? How can I write this? And so as a result, I think it changed my poetry. And reading to group made me more aware of what do people want? What do people respond to? Because, as a teacher, you can see that moment of, where you just get recognition, where you can tell that the poem does something. So I think reading at the slam, reading at the diatribes, you can see that. You can see the reaction. I think that helped me a lot to be, okay, what works? What do people connect with? What gets a response in people? So it helped in that. A poet laureateship, I think I applied a couple of times, but didn't get chosen. But that's always good. Lou Klatt, somebody mentioned, and always enjoyed hearing him. And some of the other laureates, yeah. Poetry has a very limited appeal, unfortunately. People think you can't understand it, or it's highbrow and it's not for your normal Jane or Joe, and like that. So I think that poetry can speak to a community, and it can be something that can educate people, something maybe that can motivate people, and so I think that diatribes is good for that because people will come to hear the poets. It's just because sometimes it's a part of the festival activities, yeah. Well, Greg Bliss, who ran the slam, and most people who are involved in poetry scene know him. I liked his poetry, and I just loved listening to him. And he had one poem, and I'm not going to attempt to do it, but it's called The Scat Man, and he imitated somebody who was how do you say, had some kind of mental condition. But like a lot of the prophets of old, because of that, people listen to him, and he's almost prophetic, and he's magical in people's eyes. But he'd start that out with with all this noise making, and I always remember him doing that. And I just love that poem, yeah. And I remember another thing, a woman poet, and I don't remember her name. She's real tall and had red hair, but she did a poem, and it was kind of deadpan, and it had a rather funny and very obscene ending. And it's just one of the funniest things I can remember either, because you weren't expecting the ending like that. And so I remember that, and I was running the slam that night. And when she walked down from the stage, I ran over and got down on my knees. And, I bowed like that because I thought her performance was so good and so well done. So those are a couple that just popped to mind at once. The competition, I think, was good. It was always friendly. People didn't get sore if they lost, and I cannot remember ever anybody griping at somebody or attacking somebody because they won. There were times when I think in the scoring, I disagreed. I said, no, but yeah, that was just a little minor thing that you put up with. So I thought the competition was good. Competition at its best will bring things out in you, and so I liked it for that reason. I thought it was good. Yeah. I mentioned as a teacher, you can see when your students get it, when something affects it. I remember one time, it was around Easter, and we read an old poem by John Donne called Good Friday, 1613, Riding Westward. And he's considered one of the first modern poets, even though he lived back then. He sort of expressed himself. And so, reading this poem, and he talks about his religious thoughts and on Good Friday, and as he can't attend church because he has to go someplace. And so he talks about these things. And then he says, he has a line, and I've seen this happen several times. He says, but though these things that I leave behind are not in my sight, yet they are in my mind. And the students, for some reason, get that. They understand. And Donne is in the transition where, people's sensibilities were more outward to where they turned more inward, in the Renaissance that changed. So they light up. They get that verse. They understand that. And not just one class. I see that happen again and again. So those moments validate, and I've seen those moments in the slam too, when people really get it, when it affects them to the degree that you can see it. You can see their eyes glimmer. You can see their expression change. So yeah, that happened several times, and that always validates you as a poet. Yeah, the slam was very democratic, and even if you won first place or people applauded, we're all equal. So it didn't encourage ego trips or anything like that. So the overall thing, I cannot think of one specific moment that really validated me. I write about a lot. I write about a lot of subjects. In fact, inspiration, I hate to use that word. To me, inspiration means just getting an idea. I don't think the muse comes down and inhabits me or anything like that. But, I got the idea for a poem, and I actually wrote one before I came here. It's in a rough draft. And so I write, and it was about music, playing music. I'm a musician too. But I write things on all kinds of things. I really don't see any one particular theme that I come back to. Yeah, a lot of it's autobiographical. The two of the poems that I won the Dire Ives with were autobiographical. And, if you ever read any of my poems, I always put dates. And I joke with myself that, I ought to put a date after every poem because the poems with dates on them seem to do well. So yeah, they're autobiographical. Gary, 1961, autobiographical. There's another one called Easter Sunday, I think 1956. That's the same thing. So yeah, I write autobiographical poems, but then I write purely thematic poems. I write poems on ideas. I write poems on literature too. Oh yeah, and I was going to say, Dave Cope told me one time, he says, we had a reading one time and I read several of those poems. And he says, Dave, you do best when you do poems like that. Poems about your childhood, poems about your experience growing up, poems about yourself. So yeah. But Gary, 1961, which was one of my Dire Ives winners. And then I got a call and somebody said, we are putting together a anthology of poems about Indiana. Can we include your poem? Now that really, that was really something. Published in Evansville Review, published something in First Things. And First Things is really it's a religious magazine, but it's really high level, popular. That one kind of surprised me as well. And so those would be probably the two most. Yeah, a lot of journals have a short half-life. It's hard to keep them up and keep them going. And so I'll publish in some, and then the journal will go out of print. But it's still nice to get them around. And of course, a lot of the journals are online today. They're not print journals. They're online journals. I had a student at Cornerstone. I guess I could mention her name on this, Amy Housecamp. She's married, so it wasn't Amy Housecamp back then, but she has started her career as a poet and has been published in some pretty good journals. She's published in Windhover, which is, there's a feeding chain with journals. And Windhover's pretty high on the top, toward the top of the feeding chain. And she won an award this year. So, yeah, she stands out as a student, probably the one that's gone the farthest as a poet. Yeah. I look at the first stuff that I published would have been in the late 80s when I first started really publishing poetry. And, the same traits are there. Now, poetry, you study craft. There is a craft to poetry. There's a way to do it. And my craft has improved, I think, maybe. I look at the first book I published 2 chapbooks of poetry. And the first one, you kind of look at it. There are some good poems. There's some mediocre poems. And there's some poems that are not bad, but not so good, And so you grow as a poet. For me, it was kind of a circuitous or something. I ran into a poet. I had a poet I really admired. She lived in Greece, though she's an American. Her name is Alicia Stallings, one of the top poets in the world. And I was taking a group of students over there for a month, to tour Greece, as a class. And so I got her email off her page, and I said, I really like your poetry. Could we meet? And then to my astonishment, she wrote back and said, sure, And so we met over there at a restaurant. We talked for about an hour. And she told me, she said, have you ever heard of the Westchester Poetry Conference? And that was at Westchester University in Pennsylvania. And I said, no. And she said, you ought to go to that. And so you went there, and there were a lot of high-level poets that were there. And there was a lot of emphasis on publication. And since they were academic and they were publishing things, they could put you on to journals that might take you and journals that you might be interested in. They really emphasized publishing quite a bit. So I think that's why I got into publishing, learned how to research journals, and learned how to submit, learned which ones, okay, this is not my style, so I don't want to waste my time on that one. And so found ones journals that published my kind of poetry. So it's sort of it's sort of a research endeavor that you do. There's just a lot of good poetry. I heard so much good poetry at the Slam. Like I say, the red-haired woman who did the funny ending. That was I'll never forget that. There are a couple of poets that used to come up from Kalamazoo that were really good, and they were more almost like beat poets, Allen Ginsberg types, and from that era. And there were a lot of good just hip hop poets. One time, I was doing a reading. It wasn't the Slam; it was someplace else. But this African-American guy came in, and he was old, and he did a rhymed version of Genesis, like about the first 3/4 of the biblical book of Genesis, all in rhyme and hip-hop rhythm. And I am just standing there astounded. I had never heard anything that good in my life. And I wish, with everything, that I knew who he was. And, I wonder if he's ever recorded that, because it was just some of the most amazing poetry I've ever heard. I remember that. I wrote one about growing up and a photograph from my childhood. And I did not have a very happy childhood. My parents fought, and they never divorced, but, they're angry, unfulfilled, unhappy people, unfortunately. I have to say that. I love them, and, they provided for us and, didn't beat us up or anything. But it was just, it was not a very happy home I grew up with. So I wrote one poem about that and about a photograph. And that won a Dire Ives. And when I read it, I didn't cry, but I almost did, So some of the poems are very emotional like that, yeah. There were a few. Gary, 1961, the Dire Ives winner, that one touched on it too. So yeah, and there are, I think, probably others, but those are the two that suggest themselves first. I'll tell a little story if I can do that. When I won Dire Eyes the first time, I think my son was 15. And he was a cool teenager. And so I come into the house one time, and he's laying on the couch watching TV, and he says, "Dad, you got a call." And I said, "Oh, yeah, who was it from?" And he says, "Dire Eyes." And I said, "Oh, what did they say?" He goes, "You won." And I said, "I did?" He said, and then he tried to sound a little more, "Yeah, you won." Then he went back to watching TV. It's a typical teenager, So, yeah. Well, I guess for me, the poems that I read about my childhood and other poems about bad experiences, it's like a lot of people say, it's cathartic. It gets it out. And you carry things inside, and then I think in poetry, you get them out sometimes, and you can look at them. And yeah, they might still make you cry when you read them or mention them, but they're out, and you understand a little bit more. And maybe you have more sympathy for your parents. Maybe you have more sympathy for you as a kid. Why was I so messed up as a teenager? Well, because I got so messed up as a kid because of those things. And so it works like that, yeah. Yeah, and the one I've been talking about, I think it was the second win that I had from Dire Eyes, and it's called Gary 1961. And the things in the poem are true. I did not make them up. So, get it here. And it is in my new book, Tawny Grammar. Get a copy. That's my commercial. Okay, Gary 1961. Years ago, in 1961, we saw them. My cousin Leroy and me, boys in the grit and soot of Gary, Indiana, watched a wedge of Canada geese cut the air above the toxic dust that settled from the steel mills to coat trees, swing sets, and clotheslines in my uncle's backyard. You could see Gary all the way from Demont back then, and you could smell it all the way from Crown Point. You could see the orange cloud the steel mills made, billowing like an angry genie, granting the wishes of industrialists for wealth and power, but spitefully scattering acid on the ground below as ribbons of steel ran and furnaces created poisonous salamanders who burrowed down into the soil and thrashed in the waters of Lake Michigan. He and I were enraptured watching the perfect wedge of birds cut the clear air up above, geese honking, going north to cleaner nesting grounds, rolling their wings slowly above the patch of foulness where we stood, our feet soaking up death from PCBs and sulfur dioxide, gums bleeding from heavy metals, noses constricted, and lungs aching, from coal and lime filtering silent as death into our blood. Leroy's dad, my father's brother, died of lung cancer, even though he retired to a warm, clean air refuge in Arkansas. Leroy's wife would later kill him with a gun during some drunken, pointless lovers' quarrel. The mills in Gary are shut down now, the air even a little cleaner than it was back then. No more orange clouds or pollutants that would dissolve my Aunt Jerry's nylons if she hung them outside to dry. I wonder if the geese have found another route, or if they still cut their way in the shape of a sideways V up above it all, above the sin and pollution, up where everything is colder but clearer, where human folly is only a smudge on the landscape far below. And I wonder if boys still stop and gaze up at them and marvel at their airy symmetry. Okay. That was a winner. That was a Dire Eyes winner. Beautiful. As a literature professor, I studied Chinese poetry, world literature I used to take. So there was a Chinese poet named Du Fu. And I always liked his stuff. He's very brief, like a lot of Chinese poets, very succinct, very brief and to the point. And I was out at the Meyer Gardens Japanese garden one time and saw this lovely flower display. And then Du Fu, I don't know, spirit of him descended on me, or I was reminded his poetry. And Billy Collins makes fun of this. The Chinese poets would sometimes have a title longer than the poem, if you read many of them. So here's this one that I wrote. Walking through the summer gardens, I long for snow. After Du Fu. Walking through the summer gardens, I long for snow to mute the riot of colors and hang the branches of the flowering trees with chaste bright ornaments.